It's Prince Charles like you rarely see him. He made a video to celebrate the 40th anniversary of a hugely popular Australian show and an interview he'll never forget, not to mention the interviewer.
For years, Charles Spencer appeared determined to keep one particular comparison buried beneath layers of royal history. But when Meghan's name entered a private conversation about Diana, something changed. One carefully chosen remark escaped, and suddenly, the palace was facing a comparison nobody had prepared to hear. Charles Spencer had spent decades carrying a burden few outsiders could fully understand. He was not simply Diana's brother. He had become one of the people permanently tied to protecting her memory, knowing that every mention of her name could reopen old wounds, revive old accusations, or become ammunition in a new royal battle. That was precisely why he had remained so careful whenever Harry and Meghan became the subject of public controversy. He reportedly believed silence served Diana better than another family confrontation. The Sussex dispute already carried enough anger, accusation, and emotional history. Adding Diana to it risked turning her life into a weapon for whichever side needed the strongest argument. Yet, behind closed doors, Spencer could not ignore what was happening. Again and again, Meghan's experiences were being compared with Diana's. The scrutiny, the isolation, the strained relationship with royal life. Harry himself had spoken with unmistakable fear about history repeating itself. At first, Spencer stayed away from those comparisons. He understood Harry's pain too well to dismiss it casually. Then, during one intensely private discussion, everything shifted. The conversation reportedly began with Harry, Meghan, and the emotional consequences of leaving royal life. Diana's name surfaced almost naturally. Spencer listened, but said little. He knew the danger. A single sentence from Diana's brother could travel far beyond that room and acquire a meaning he had never intended. But someone pushed the comparison further. Suddenly, Diana was no longer being mentioned as a warning from history. She was being used as a near mirror for Meghan's experience. That, reportedly, was the point at which Spencer's restraint began to break. He believed an invisible boundary had been crossed, one involving Diana's sacrifices, her private struggles, and the complexity of a life outsiders often reduced to simple symbols. So Spencer finally answered. The reaction was immediate. His words were not loud, yet the room understood their weight. This was not gossip. It was Diana's brother challenging one of the most emotionally powerful assumptions surrounding Meghan and Harry. But Spencer's reaction did not begin with Meghan at all. To understand why one comparison disturbed him so deeply, the story had to return to the woman whose memory still shadows nearly every conflict inside the House of Windsor. Diana left behind jewels, letters, photographs, sons, and memories, but her most dangerous inheritance was something no vault could contain. Her story became emotional currency. Decades later, everyone surrounding the monarchy understood one uncomfortable truth. Whoever appeared closest to Diana's legacy possessed extraordinary symbolic power. That power was unlike any title the monarchy could grant. Estates could change hands, jewels could pass from one generation to another, ceremonial roles could disappear overnight. But Diana's memory remained untouchable, and with it came an influence far greater than anything locked inside a palace vault. For Harry, that inheritance was deeply personal. Diana was not simply a historical figure whose name carried public weight. She was his mother, and the trauma of losing her had shaped the way he interpreted danger, pressure, and loyalty. Whenever Meghan faced intense scrutiny, those old fears reportedly returned with force. To Harry, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Diana's jewelry only deepened that connection. Every ring, bracelet, necklace, or watch linked to her carried meaning beyond money. When Meghan appeared wearing something associated with Diana, the symbolism was immediate. It invited comparisons between two women who had faced enormous attention and pressure within the royal world. But Spencer reportedly saw a danger beneath that symbolism. He understood why Harry treasured those connections, yet he feared Diana's complicated life was slowly being reduced into a simple pattern. Another woman enters royal life, suffers under pressure, and becomes Diana's reflection. To him, that was too easy. Diana had contradictions, private struggles, loyalties, mistakes, and choices that could not simply be transferred onto someone else. More importantly, inheriting Diana's possessions did not mean inheriting the right to decide what Diana herself would have believed. Spencer had reportedly watched both supporters and critics invoke her memory whenever it strengthened their argument. One side used Diana to defend Harry and Meghan. Another used her to challenge them. Each time, Diana became less of a person and more of a weapon, and that crossed a private line Spencer had never openly explained. In his mind, Diana's suffering belonged to her story. It could be remembered, mourned, and learned from, but it should never be reshaped into ammunition for someone else's battle. That private rule might have remained unbroken forever, until Harry made one deeply emotional decision that brought Meghan, Diana, and the Spencer family into the same conversation. Harry believed he was protecting the woman he loved by invoking the woman he had lost. But inside the Spencer family, that comparison carried consequences he may never have anticipated. What sounded like devotion to Harry reportedly sounded very different to the people who had known Diana before the world did. For Harry, the connection seemed painfully simple. When Meghan faced relentless scrutiny, isolation, or pressure from the institution around her, he did not see abstract similarities. He felt old fear returning. The possibility that another woman he loved could become trapped beneath the same kind of public pressure carried an emotional force few outsiders could easily understand. That was why, in Harry's mind, invoking Diana was not strategy. It was warning. But Charles Spencer reportedly heard something different. He had known Diana before she became a global symbol, before every chapter of her life was endlessly interpreted by people who had never sat beside her in private. He remembered the contradictions, the stubbornness, the vulnerability, and the choices that could never fit neatly inside a public myth. The disagreement, therefore, became increasingly delicate. Harry believed his experience as Diana's son gave him a responsibility to recognize danger early and refuse to remain silent. If history carried even the slightest chance of repeating itself, he was determined to act before the damage became irreversible. Spencer, however, questioned whether preventing repetition required more than identifying similarities. Perhaps it also required admitting where the stories were profoundly different. That distinction reportedly hurt Harry. To him, hesitation could sound like doubt, almost as though those closest to Diana were refusing to acknowledge what he believed he was seeing happen again. Yet Spencer feared the opposite danger. If every difficulty Meghan experienced was filtered through Diana's history, then Diana herself risked becoming less human with every comparison. She could become an argument rather than a person. Neither man wanted that. But neither seemed willing to surrender his understanding of what protecting Diana's legacy actually meant. Then, Meghan herself became part of the dispute in an unexpected way. Not through an interview, not through a statement, through something far quieter and far more emotionally loaded. And when one of Diana's most emotionally charged possessions entered the discussion, the argument stopped being philosophical, because suddenly legacy could be held in someone's hand. Royal jewels are supposed to communicate continuity, but one Diana-linked piece reportedly created the opposite effect. The moment it became connected to Meghan, an old question returned with startling force: does inheriting something once worn by Diana also grant permission to inherit the emotional meaning attached to it? The value of the jewel was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what it represented. In royal circles, jewelry can carry rules that are never written down. Who owns it? Who may wear it? When it appears? What its history suggests? And, perhaps most dangerously, what the public decides it means. For Harry, Diana's possessions were never meant to become museum pieces frozen inside grief. They were personal connections to his mother, fragments of a life he wanted to keep close. If Meghan wore something associated with Diana, he reportedly saw affection and continuity, not provocation. Meghan understood the weight as well. She knew that a Diana-linked jewel could never be treated as ordinary decoration. Every appearance carried the possibility of interpretation. A bracelet could become a statement. A ring could become a comparison. A necklace could revive an entire emotional history. That was where Spencer's unease reportedly deepened. His concern was not that Meghan should be denied Diana's possessions. It was what happened after she wore them. Palace watchers and royal commentators began treating those pieces as proof that Meghan had inherited more than jewelry, as though she had stepped into Diana's emotional place in Harry's life, and, by extension, into Diana's symbolic position within the royal story. For Spencer, that was a dangerous leap. Private inheritance was one thing. Public succession to Diana's identity was something entirely different. And there were whispers of another piece, one regarded as effectively untouchable, not because a formal rule prohibited its use, but because those closest to Diana understood its emotional meaning too well. That unspoken boundary only sharpened the larger question. Who truly had authority over Diana's legacy? Her sons? Her siblings? The institution she once belonged to? Or a public that had spent decades claiming part of her story as its own? Suddenly, the disagreement was no longer about a jewel. It was about ownership of memory itself, yet the jewel itself was only the trigger. Because Spencer's real concern was already forming around something much harder to control, the story Meghan and Diana were beginning to share in the public imagination. Then, Charles Spencer finally said it. Not an insult, not an accusation, something quieter and far more devastating. According to the story unfolding behind closed doors, he separated Meghan from Diana with one sentence so precise that the room reportedly fell silent before anyone understood what it meant. The conversation had returned to the same dangerous ground. What Diana might have thought about Meghan, Harry, and the painful distance that had opened between them and the monarchy. At first, Spencer reportedly listened without interrupting. He had already heard enough comparisons to know where such discussions usually went. Then, someone suggested that Diana would have recognized Meghan's struggle immediately, almost as though the two women had been forced through the same emotional journey. Spencer let it pass. But when the comparison became stronger, when Diana's life was presented less as history and more as a direct blueprint for Meghan's experience, he finally intervened. Diana never wanted another woman to become Diana. She wanted her sons to become free of what happened to her. The words were devastating because they were not aimed at Meghan. They were aimed at the assumption itself. Spencer was not denying that Meghan had faced pressure. He was rejecting the idea that honoring Diana required another woman to inherit her suffering, her symbolism, or her place inside Harry's emotional world. For Harry, the remark reportedly landed differently. His instinct to protect Meghan had long been tied to one promise he seemed determined never to break. He would not stand by and allow history to repeat itself. Yet Spencer's words introduced a painful possibility. What if Harry's effort to escape Diana's tragedy had actually kept him emotionally bound to it? Meghan reportedly appeared stunned for another reason. For years, others had drawn parallels between her and Diana, sometimes sympathetically, sometimes critically. Spencer's remark suddenly removed her from that role altogether. And perhaps that was the point. He was not claiming to know exactly what Diana would say today. In fact, his argument was that nobody should casually claim that authority. That was why the sentence began moving quietly through private circles. It challenged palace critics who invoked Diana against Meghan, but it also unsettled Sussex supporters who used Diana to strengthen Meghan's story. But the sentence that stunned the room carried an even more painful implication for Harry, and once he understood it, the conversation between uncle and nephew became intensely personal. Harry could dismiss palace criticism. He could challenge courtiers, commentators, even relatives. But Charles Spencer occupied a different place in Diana's story. Hearing those words from his mother's brother reportedly struck somewhere much deeper, and what Harry asked next transformed the disagreement into a question about grief itself. Harry reportedly turned the argument back towards Spencer with a painful challenge. If Diana and Meghan were not as closely connected as he believed, then had he misunderstood his own mother's experience all these years? Spencer did not accept that conclusion. Harry's memories, he reportedly explained, were real and deeply important. But they were also the memories of a son who had lost his mother while still painfully young. That did not make them less true. It meant they represented one part of Diana rather than every part of her. That distinction cut to the heart of the conflict. To Harry, Diana had been mum. To Spencer, she had also been a sister with private fears, contradictions, loyalties, humor, anger, and choices that existed long before she became an international symbol. Others remembered a princess. Friends remembered another version entirely. The world had created yet another Diana from headlines, photographs, and grief. Spencer reportedly suggested that Harry's love for his mother could sometimes make separate dangers feel connected. When Meghan suffered, the emotional alarm inside him did not begin with Meghan alone. It carried echoes of everything he believed had happened before. Harry pushed back. Ignoring warning signs, he believed, was exactly how tragedy became possible in the first place. To separate the two stories too sharply felt almost reckless. Meghan reportedly stayed quiet through part of the exchange. She was beginning to understand that she had become the center of an argument whose deepest wound existed years before she entered Harry's life. Then Spencer made the distinction that changed everything again. Protecting Meghan, he suggested, should begin with what Meghan actually needed, not with defeating ghosts from Diana's past. Suddenly, this was no longer Spencer against Meghan. It was memory against reality, grief against the present, and Harry trapped between them. Then came the question nobody in the room could easily answer. Then, what do you think Mum would actually say to me now? Spencer's answer would never remain merely a private family reflection, because beyond that room the palace had its own reasons for fearing any public discussion linking Diana, Meghan, and Harry. The palace had survived interviews, memoirs, accusations, departures, and years of family tension. But Charles Spencer represented something different. He was neither a working royal nor an outsider looking inward. He belonged to Diana's blood family, and that made every sentence he uttered uniquely difficult to control. Spencer carried a kind of authority Buckingham Palace could neither grant nor remove. When he spoke about Diana, people listened differently. He had known her before the titles, before the global mythology, before her private pain became part of royal history. Yet he stood outside the institution itself. free from many of the restraints that governed those still serving the crown. That independence made his remark dangerous. If palace figures appeared to embrace what he had said, they risked turning Diana's memory into a weapon against Harry and Meghan. It could look calculated, even cruel, as though the institution had discovered a new way to challenge the Sussex narrative using Diana's own brother. But rejecting Spencer carried another danger entirely. Any attempt to dismiss him could reopen old questions about Diana, the monarchy, and the painful history between the Spencer family and the House of Windsor. The palace therefore faced an impossible balance: acknowledge too much, and the remark became political. Say too little, and silence itself could invite suspicion. At the center of that tension stood William. He carried the same loss as Harry, but his future demanded something different. He was not simply Diana's son. He was also tied to the monarchy's future, forced to protect an institution his brother had increasingly challenged. Courtiers reportedly preferred one outcome above all: silence. Keep Spencer's words private. Keep Diana away from another public family war. Keep the jewel controversy from becoming proof of who possessed the greater claim to her memory. But emotionally charged remarks rarely remain contained once enough people know them. Whispers spread. Interpretations multiplied. Soon even Diana-linked jewelry was being discussed not simply as inheritance, but as evidence of symbolic legitimacy. And that was when William's position became impossible to ignore. Palace strategists may have expected him to defend the institution or quietly support his uncle. Instead, his private reaction reportedly revealed something far more complicated. Something rooted not in strategy, but in the different ways two brothers had survived the same loss. And when William finally learned exactly what his uncle had said, he did not simply side with Spencer or Harry. His reaction exposed the deeper fracture the brothers had never resolved. William did not explode. He did not issue a statement. According to the dramatized account, his response was almost painfully calm. Yet within a family where silence often communicates more than speeches, the few words attributed to him reportedly confirmed what Harry had feared for years. The brothers remembered Diana differently. William reportedly understood Spencer's warning immediately. Diana's memory, powerful as it remained, could not become a permanent template through which every new royal conflict was judged. To do that would risk flattening her life into a single tragedy and turning every later disagreement into another version of the past. But William did not dismiss Harry either. He understood why his brother saw danger where others saw difference. They had lived through the same loss, even if they had carried it in very different ways. Harry's fear did not need to be mocked to be questioned. That made William's position painfully complicated. Empathy was not agreement. According to the account, he made one distinction that cut through the emotion. Diana belonged to both brothers, but neither of them possessed the right to decide exactly how she would judge every modern crisis. It was a quiet statement, yet it reinforced Spencer's argument without directly attacking Meghan. For Harry, that restraint may have hurt more than open criticism. Two people deeply connected to Diana, her brother and her eldest son, were refusing to fully validate the comparison he considered central to his understanding of Meghan's struggles. The isolation was no longer political. It was personal. Meghan reportedly began confronting a different question. Perhaps being constantly linked to Diana did not strengthen her position at all. Perhaps it trapped her inside impossible expectations, forcing every decision, every criticism, and every public appearance into a story written before she arrived. That possibility changed the meaning of Spencer's words. What had first sounded like exclusion could also be heard as release. Meghan did not have to inherit Diana's identity to be taken seriously. She did not need to become a symbol of someone else's pain. But Harry faced the harder truth. If Meghan did not need to become Diana, then protecting her could no longer mean endlessly fighting his mother's unfinished battles. That realization leads to the final and most unexpected twist. Because Spencer's remark was never truly about rejecting Meghan. It was about what Diana's family believed Harry still needed to release. By the time the shock faded, the meaning of Charles Spencer's remark had completely changed. Meghan had appeared to be its subject. Diana had appeared to be its purpose. But beneath both women stood Harry, and the possibility that the person Spencer was truly trying to reach had always been his nephew. Seen that way, Spencer's intervention was not simply about defending Diana's memory. It was also about freeing Harry from the need to keep reliving the circumstances that had shaped his deepest fears. Meghan's place in the story changed with that realization. She was no longer being framed as someone trying to inherit Diana's role. Instead, she appeared burdened by a comparison so powerful that it threatened to consume her own identity. Every criticism became another echo. Every act of protection became another reminder. Every Diana-linked jewel carried the risk of turning affection into symbolism. But Spencer's message was more complicated than rejection. Two lives could share similarities without becoming interchangeable. A bracelet could still represent love. A necklace could still carry family history. A treasured possession could pass from one generation to another without transferring the identity, pain, or destiny of the woman who once wore it. William's position also became clearer. If he was to carry Diana's memory into the future, while also carrying the monarchy itself, then perhaps his greatest responsibility was refusing to let her become ammunition in battles she could no longer answer. For Harry, however, the choice remained deeply personal. He could continue measuring every threat against the tragedy of the past, or he could protect Meghan according to the reality standing in front of him now. And Meghan reportedly began to understand Spencer's remark differently. What first sounded like separation could also sound like permission. Permission to stop being compared. Permission to stop carrying Diana's symbolism. Permission simply to be herself. Spencer, meanwhile, returned to the silence he had guarded for so long. And perhaps that was why one quiet sentence carried more force than another palace statement ever could. Because behind the titles, jewels, inheritance, and carefully guarded memories remained one unresolved question. Can Harry honor Diana without continuing to live inside the tragedy that took her away?